Hi, Kendra Cotton. Probably everyone I think on this panel is a native Georgian, but myself. I moved here in 2016 after 16 years in North Carolina. I am a wife, I am a mother, I am a community activist, and I'm super excited to be here today. A little bit about my background. I call myself a PhD dropout. I taught race and American politics, Black politics, thought I was going to be a professor. But I left right before writing and completing that dissertation because I thought that my talents would best be suited in actually doing the work. And so that's what I've been committed to doing since I left. I have been a statewide campaign manager for ballot initiatives and for a state treasurer's race, for a U.S. Senate race. And just super excited to be here. I feel like I have some skin in the game and that I live north of and have children in public schools, a daughter and two sons. And so really just hope to kind of bring that perspective and talk to folks and meet people, where they are so that we can all live and work together to effectuate change.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And last but
I think this is a very tense time for everyone who is a citizen of the United States. As for me and my family individually, I think we are, managing both COVID and still doing the social distancing, and what that, kind of means for us, just the five of us in our little family unit. But then also our hearts are very heavy with the current events and the stress of what that means. And then the added stress. In our home, we have a 13-year-old boy and a 15-year-old boy. And having those conversations about, what is happening. Our daughter is a freshman in college. And so she is, chomping at the bits to kind of hit the streets, right, and be out there protesting. And so also trying to manage that, right, because we're concerned for her safety and in things that are going on, particularly with law enforcement utilizing things like rubber bullets and, that are, beginning to, maim some of the folks that are out there, even folks that are peacefully protesting. And so, I think like everyone else, we are mourning with the families whose loved ones have been harmed at the hands of folks who were supposed to be acting as agents of the state. But to be quite candid, this is nothing new for people of color. What I keep telling folks in my circle and who I'm talking with is that, we really need to find out who it is that truly is responsible for the invention of the cell phone camera. Because the invention of the cell phone camera is what has changed this conversation. Because what has happened is that everything that we have always talked about freely, and when I say we, I say people in the Black community, freely and openly in our churches, on the phone, whatever, now it's chronicled, it's on tape, and it's getting out there and people are seeing it, right? So before, even if you had friends who were non-Black and they listened, there's still a little bit of skepticism, right? Unless there's that one-on-one relationship. But now it's undeniable, right? And so I think that is what's moving and sparking people to change. So for that, when you ask, how am I feeling? I'm actually feeling a little hopeful because I'm like, perhaps now people will see why it is so frustrating, to hear people worry about law and order and, and to have that type of rhetoric out there when the state, and again, I understand there are other actors, but when the state should not be doing harm in the way that they have been, inflicting harm to the Black community. So for me, I am a little hopeful that this is finally going to be a catalyst for change. But I will, let one of the other panelists speak up. Reverend, do you have? I think for me, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sister Cotton.
I was going to say, I think for me, since this is a community conversation and we are, trying to be instructive and kind of, talk to folks, like I think we should, certainly be very intentional about delivering, kind of action items, and particularly for folks who are raising young children, who are non-Black and who are looking, and, asking themselves, what can I do better? I always use the term intentionality because I feel like a lot of parents non-Black parents do not put enough emphasis on race and racial differences and showing respect and appreciating. I think there was, when I was growing up, a lot of my white friends, because I did grow up in a predominantly white environment, were their parents collectively were like, oh, we don't see color, or we that has never been true, right? Like that has never been anything that occurred. I think it was just some things because people were uncomfortable with speaking about race, right? So that's what they would try to just say to their kids. But those same kids would be in the hallways, but wearing Confederate flags and calling people out their names and acting out because their parents were not intentional. And so one of the things that I am always talking with my white friends about is that I need you to see what my family and I look like, and I need you to respect that, right? And I need your children to understand that there are differences. There are things that in a normative sense I would love for my children to be able to do that they're just simply not able to. And let me just throw out a little anecdote. It's about a level of freedom that Black people do not understand that white people have. I mean, we used to always laugh even at school, like when crossing the road, something as simple as crossing a crosswalk. A Black student, you watch us, and I encourage all of y'all, if you want to get a laugh, our heads are on a swivel until we make eye contact with that driver so that we know we can go across. My white friends, oh, y'all step out in the street with wild abandon, backpack on, like, hey, because nobody is going to hit you. And what I'm saying is that response is because of systemic agents out here of which we have no control. So we socialize our children as a response to what we see in the world. And so we have to get to a place where white people, see that because it's right before you. And I think that's what gets so frustrating for people of color, because you will hear people who have lived 60 years and saying, well, what can I do better? And you're like, what? You've been alive longer than I have. So like you were living this, you were propagating a lot of this, right? And so it's like, it's hard for us to see how didn't you see it? It makes no difference if you were living in an all-white community. You have TV, you have access to social media, you saw these injustices, but still went to the lake, but still went to an all-white church, but still had, it's a conscious choice that I think people won't acknowledge that they've done. And I'm not trying to vilify the choice. I'm just simply saying acknowledge it. And just go on from there. I think it goes from when people make residential decisions. When we came to Georgia and we went to buy a house, people were like, oh, you don't want to move to the McEachern district. You want to move to Hillgrove. And I was like, no, I'm good at McEachern. I didn't care that it was 90% minority. Well, I'm a minority. But it blew my mind that, a real estate agent who was Black was telling me this based upon our socioeconomic status. And I'm like, no. So, I mean, I think the onus is on us to be intentional about making sure that we aren't subscribing to a lot of the negative stereotypes that are out there about Black and brown people.
And see,
yeah, I would add to your list the citizens arrest law here in Georgia needs to be taken off.
Yeah.
That's some trash. Go ahead, Reverend.
No, that's crazy. I'm just agreeing. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
I've never heard of anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm not from Georgia either, Sister Cotton. I'm from Alabama and Florida. I was still in the South, not in Georgia, but that's just crazy.
Right. This idea that, someone, that, because I guess with the Ahmaud Arbery, and I would love for us to talk about that for a moment, because that is right here in Georgia. But what people have to understand when they're talking about why are people looting? Why are people, so aggrieved and angry? Listen, it was not until that law enforcement had the tape, okay? They looked at the tape and they made a decision and sanctioned that young man's murder. It wasn't until the tape was leaked, activists when the NAACP elevated it, okay? And so then the public saw it, and you saw a public outcry. 2 full months, I believe 45 days, actually. 2 full months had passed, and the state wasn't going to do a thing until people started taking action. And so when you hear folks, wax nostalgic, oh, you just have to let the state or, the laws work. What Black people know historically has never been the case for us, particularly at the local and state levels. What has always happened, and why Black people focus so much on the presidency and the US Senate and congressional seats, is because in the history of our country, it has always been the federal government that has had to come in and intervene against local and state forces so that Black people could get some type of justice. If it wasn't for the federal government, we would never have desegregation. If it wasn't for the federal government, there would never have been a Civil Rights Act. And so when white people want to say, oh, but law enforcement is there to protect you, when somebody shows me a black and white picture of the civil rights and you have people marching, peacefully, what I always tell them is, honey, that's 5 minutes before the state police unleashed the dogs. That's 5 minutes before the state police unleashed the water hoses. And so don't tell me about the state being something that protects you, because that's never been our relationship. The state was always meant to keep us in our places, right? That's what the state police. And so then even when you had desegregation, we have to come to terms with the fact that was 1968 when that stuff was happening. I was born in 1977. They did not fire all of the people in those law enforcement houses, and they didn't fire them when they desegregated. No, those people went and they became sergeants and captains and DEA officials, and now they're in leadership. And I'm telling you, their hearts and minds didn't change, which is why we still have the police brutality towards Black and brown people that occurs. And so when people say, well, why don't you just follow in his direction? Because what we know is whether I follow the direction or not, particularly if it's a Black male, Black women are not exempt, but particularly if it's a Black male, that brother, when he is released from lockup, if he ever sees freedom again, is going to be battered or bruised. He will have been, abused in some kind of way. There is a lack of respect for Blackness. And that's what we have to get to the root of. Like, how I raise my children to deal with law enforcement should pain me, but it doesn't, because it is simply my reality. Like, it is just, and is that PTSD? Is that psychological trauma? I don't know, but that's all I know. My babies know, keep your license and registration. You don't put that in a glove box, because you don't need to be reaching for anything. You keep that above you so that they can always see your hands in your visor. Like, it's little things like that that just people don't think about, even myself. And so, I want to give you guys a chance to answer, but what I'm saying is that there are so many things that we carry on a day-to-day basis that I think our white, fellow citizens do not have any comprehension of that. Just none whatsoever. And but you see it. That's all I'm saying, but you see it. Even if you don't feel it, I feel like you guys see what happens. And that is what is so frustrating to me.
Yeah, I would like, is not the reality for Black Americans.
But also, I want to interject, because I want you to continue your story, but I think it's very important too that, folks understand law is not synonymous with right or just. No. And so that's what people also need to understand. The law, where Black people historically in America have been concerned, has not always been on the side of the righteous.
Exactly.
Okay? So when people talk to me about law, I have no problem flouting it because I know that there's always a gray area, or always has been, where Black people, it was illegal for me to vote. It was illegal for me to sit next to you in a classroom. It was illegal for us to shop at the same time. It was illegal. And so that's what I'm saying. It was illegal for a Black and white person to marry. So, so when people talk to me about the law, I'm like, miss me with that, because laws change. So that, I just want to.
No, I totally agree with you. And
it does, but I will say this: the hate crimes bill would have done nothing to save Ahmaud Arbery's life. It would have done nothing to save George Floyd's life. That is like, yes, that's great, and we could get that on the books, but I also consider it to be a bit of a red herring, because what it enables the state of Georgia to do is say that we did something without really effectuating change, like repealing the citizens arrest law.
That was the other one.
Yeah, the citizens arrest law is what is heinous here. And yes, I'm not saying we do not need a hate crimes bill on the books. I'm saying that should not be the goal.
Yeah, that's, that's kind of, I would love to hear what y'all.
Yes, ma'am. Sister Kendra.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree. I think for Ms. Smalls, who's over, the African American caucus there in Cherokee County, I think one of the services that perhaps y'all can offer is educating the community about the slate of candidates there locally. It is so cumbersome for people to have to, figure out, what these judges are about, to figure out, whether the sheriff's candidates are viable. And what we really do need is, more folks across the state in their respective counties putting together slate cards. And what a slate card is, I know coming from North Carolina, but you could not go vote in Durham, North Carolina without the Committee on the Affairs of Black People handing you a slate of candidates before you walked up in that building.
Sister Kendra, are you from Durham?
I lived there for 16 years.
My dad used to pastor St. Joseph AME. My brother pastors St. Joseph AME. I'm named Joseph because of St. Joseph AME. I'm from Durham.
Wonderful. Yeah, so we were there 16 years. And so, but I don't see that in Georgia. And people are hungry, just for somebody to help them filter through. When you're working, when you're worried, working 16-hour days, when you're dealing with kids, folks don't have childcare. They do not have the bandwidth to go through, hit up Google and research all of these candidates. So I think the onus is on some of us who call ourselves, activists, clergy, even, elected officials, to take some of that burden off of people and say, hey, these are folks who are aligned with what I think would be best for our community, and help them vote.
And I, Miss Matt.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think, when President Obama spoke yesterday, and I listened to his remarks, and I think some of them are prescient for this conversation, in particular, when he said it is not an either or proposition, it is a both and. What I always try to tell folks, and how I reconcile it, because I too am a proponent of folks exercising the franchise by going to the polls, but there has to be an acknowledgement that when you are voting and when you are in bringing about change through the ballot box, that is incremental change. That is, you're playing the long game, because our system of government, there's a process to pass a law. There is a process to pass a local ordinance. And so I think we need to educate and be very honest with the citizenry that takes a lot of time, but what we didn't have on our side, was time, in particular in response to Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd's case. And so what I always tell people is sometimes you do have to act a little bit of a fool to get folks to pay attention. And that is what has occurred. That's why those charges were upgraded. Like what we know as, activists and people who are committed to expedient change is that when you, in America, the only color that truly matters is that green dollar. Period. So when you start hitting up some stores, right, and not stores in the hood, right, when you're going over to Gucci and to Louis Vuitton in Buckhead, now everybody is motivated. Now people want to pay attention, and they want to begin to bring folks to the table and say, hey, let's have a community conversation. It's fine for folks to sit and watch people look at the SWATs on fire, or look at, Camp Creek on fire. Like, no, but when you see Buckhead, under siege, now folks are motivated. And so while I am like, yes, we need to hit this ballot box on June 9th, and then again, well, if we have runoffs on August 11th, and then again, it would be November 3rd, that yes, 1000%. But I also do not discourage the collective action that is going on in these streets.
Oh, absolutely.
That has been necessary.
Yes, it
That
has.
has been necessary.
Yes.
I agree.
And-
but we also
yeah.
need more elected officials, coming out in solidarity. Like some of the things, and again, I understand that there are, there's an age continuum, there's generational, I am 43, I have a 19-year-old daughter. And I know that most of the people that are out in the streets are, probably, I don't know, 18 to 35, right? And so it's a different mindset. And while they don't have all the historical context, what they have is a fire in their belly for change to occur. And so, yeah, we can lead and try to, make sure that frustration and that anger and that hurt is channeled positively. But I think it's a fine line that those of us who do have more of a bully pulpit have to walk, because we don't want to neuter people either. And what I see from a lot of the rhetoric from some of our elected officials is there isn't too much emphasis on respectability. There's too much emphasis on the way things are being done. But that is the same conversation that Dr. King was having in 1968, prior to the March on Washington, when John F. Kennedy, in that June before that August march, implored him not to have it because now wasn't the time, right? So it is always very interesting to me when people mistake the action, right? So what I'm hearing in the narrative is there are the people who have the bully pulpit are vilifying the looters. They are vilifying, folks who are tearing down Confederate monuments or who are defacing property. But where is that same energy and that level of vilification for what the state did to George Floyd, for what those white supremacists did to Ahmaud Arbery, for what the state did in sanctioning the actions of those white supremacists? Because that's what, like, people say, well, those were two rogue, racist individuals, and no, that's overt and we don't stand with it. Yes, but the state said it was okay. Like 3 different district attorneys had to recuse themselves. And so that is what people are responding to. Look at the system that is oppressing. And so let me also throw this out there, because I know somebody out there listening is like, oh, but y'all are talking about this, but you don't want to talk about Black on Black crime, whatever that is, right? Let me be clear. A death is a death, right? But justice is swift when a Black person commits a crime, period. End of story. Whether it's a Black person they kill, a white person, Latino, it doesn't matter. So no, you don't have to have these types of conversations, because the state is sure enough going to handle that. But what we see is that too often these actors, these agents of the state, because if you'll notice, I rarely call them law enforcement officers, because they're not really enforcing just laws, because it's so subjective in how the laws are applied, right? So I might be speeding, you might be speeding, and they let you off, but they give me a ticket. So, the law is just in the eye of the beholder at the time. But what I'm saying is, when those Black people commit a crime, no matter who the victim is, we know that the justice system, the wheels are going to start turning immediately. They're not going to be out walking the street and at home for 45 days, eating with their families, kicking it, relaying a story. The daughter put the man's body up on Snapchat. None of that stuff is happening, because you're not free. But in the case where the white person is doing it, you have to lose your mind, hold press conferences, bring in, civil rights leaders. You have to bring in your pastor and be crying on the news and showing pain and, just acting a flat donkey just to get the state to open an investigation, like the FBI just did last week for Breonna Taylor. Last week, the officers that killed her in her home as she slept are still free.
They're still sitting home.
That is the problem. Like, that is what we need to discuss. not be worried about a few stores that have insurance, okay, that have insurance to restock and rebuild, because these lives are not coming back. So that's why we posture when somebody says, oh, but you can do it peacefully. Well, yeah, I could. And yes, those are some rabble rousers. But if I was just doing it peacefully, you would ignore that. You would ignore it. It wasn't until you saw these cop cars on fire, till you saw folks, running and looting. Then people are like, hold on, something must be done. Let's arrest the officers. Let's do anything we can to quell this unrest. And so that's why I say, hey, it was necessary, because look what is happening.
And I 100%.
But I mean, I want to take that, kind of elevate that a little bit and not let these folks off the hook, because disrespecting the flag was I've never seen a police uniform, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, that didn't have a flag on the sleeve or something. Okay. And so my whole thing is, to me, though, your actions while in uniform are a disrespect of the flag if it results in the unjust murder of a human life, right? And so don't speak to me about somebody kneeling, during the national anthem, or turning their back peacefully in protest to the American flag, when the last thing some of these brothers and women are seeing is a flag by an agent of the state, okay, who's supposed to what? Serve and what? Protect. Who rarely exercise restraint when it comes to Black and brown people. Like, I mean, I'm trying to tell you, we have innumerable examples where you could have, my mother is mentally ill, and so I live with this every day because she is housing insecure at this time. But my thing is, I see officers every day exercise all kinds of restraint for people who are unwell, who are acting belligerent, right, in the streets, when those folks are white. But the second they're not, when they first see that Black skin, it is, oh, I fear for my life. You didn't fear, you feared for your life, or you should have, when that person that was non-Black was cutting up. But it's something about that Black skin. I don't know what it is, but it's something that is so ingrained in white culture to fear it, It's like when the sun goes down at 8 o'clock, oh, hell, we all got to get in the house because the Black people are coming out. Like, it blows my mind, right? And I'm just like, I do not understand why in 2020 is that still the case. Like, and so that is such a source of frustration, because yes, when Kaepernick was kneeling and it was peaceful and a few other folks joined, in support, he was crucified. He lost his job, and people are like, oh, but these are private businesses and they have a right to do what they want to do, and they didn't want that associated with their brand. You know what? You are absolutely right. So fine. So then when other protests have percolated up, right? They didn't effectuate change. They did not. But now when you have people rabble rousing, snatching down some of these Confederate monuments, which, since I have this platform, I would like to say did not get erected until the late 1970s, and they're trash anyway. They haven't been there since the dawn of this nation. Right. The Daughters of the Confederacy propagated that crap on all these Southern states, trying to make sure that they could rewrite the annals of history to reorient the true meaning of the Civil War. And they have spun us a bill of goods, right? Because they say, oh, it's states' rights, when everybody knows that it's slavery, but we won't divulge up into that. But what I'm saying is, that is the system. Like, it's rewriting history. It's much like what white people do with Martin Luther King's legacy, which is trash. Yeah. Quick to throw out Martin Luther King and, oh, he was nonviolent. Yeah, he was. But then y'all were still arresting him. You were still abusing all of the people with him. You were still spitting on him. Everything they emanated. You're like, well, that's the way you do things. No, it's not. Because today in 2020, all these years later, we aren't locking arms and singing "We Shall Overcome," because we should have overcame already. So it's time out for that. So now you have, yes, what I think is going on is that people are not accustomed, particularly in Southern communities, of Black people with agency. And what that means is I'm not going to act deferential to you in any kind of way. We are equals. And that is an affront to a lot of people, even younger folks, because it shows what they believe to be true is a lie, right? It is when I tell people that my 19-year-old daughter, who did graduate from McEachern High School, which is 90% Black, okay, is a freshman at Harvard, their eyes buck. And I say it like she's going to Georgia State because it's nothing, it's slight work. Because what we have to normalize that, what are you talking about? Why is that special? That's excellence, because that's who we are as a community. That's the expectation. And so, but it is for a lot of people, it's like, but I did everything right, because in their mind, they would never admit it. They think that they have bought into the lie that their whiteness makes them better. And it comes out usually in competitions. It's all these little microaggressions. And so I think that's why what folks are seeing in the streets is so unsettling to them, because their norms are being challenged. They're being challenged. I know we're wrapping. I would also say something that folks, particularly, I think these conversations that I have with a lot of white women, because you guys are acculturated very differently than I think most Black women are. One, you don't want, to cause, any type of tension. I've watched it with my white girlfriends and how their mothers raised them, and, oh, it's always polite conversation, don't want to, ruffle feathers.
Step on toes.
Right, or step on toes. But I feel like, again, intentionality is so super important. And because most of these conversations and most of these comments, people find them socially acceptable because they are socially acceptable, in certain groups, right? So when you're among friends, if you will, I'll say this little anecdote and then I'll let the right reverend give us his but my daddy always tells this story of how when he was golfing with some friends, and it was his partner was this Black guy, and then the guys they were playing with were two white men. And so they were on the golf course and everything was cool, and he didn't know them very well. They were friends of the other guy. And so one of the white guys, as they got comfortable, whatever, was like, "Hey, I got a joke for you." And my dad was like, listening. He said the joke started out, there's a Mexican there, and there's a Mexican, there's a Polak, and my daddy stopped him. And he said, "No, I'm not gonna hear any of that kind of joke." And he said the man, got really embarrassed, and he was like, "Oh, well, no." And he said, "No," he said, "I'm not gonna hear it because I know when I'm not around, there's a nigga in there somewhere." And that's true. So what I'm saying is shut that stuff down when y'all are hearing it. So that people understand it is not going to be socially acceptable. I took that story that I heard when I was 12 years old and have used it my entire life. When I hear people speaking recklessly out of the side of their neck, I shut it down immediately, and I don't care who is around. And so that's where we have to get to as a society. My children know that I don't tolerate that. That goes with comments about homosexuals. I don't care, transgender. I don't tolerate any of that. That's bigotry. And we're not going to promote it. So that's what I would say white people need to do a better job of doing, is speaking up in the moment.
Well, Sister Cotton just